Hi, welcome everyone. This is ModX Virtual Exchanges. I'm Ryan Smith, joined by Ivan Rupnik. Hello, Ivan. You want to say hello?
Hey, Ryan, everybody.
We're really excited today. We're going to be talking about terminology in the offsite and modular industry. And we are prepared a short presentation here and hope this generates a lot of discussion around terminology. I think Ivan's going to be sharing a screen here so we can go through some of these ideas.
So terminology, or why we should care about what we call things, subtitled. Just moving on. One of the things that Ryan and I have noticed recently, particularly in conversations with agencies like NBI, the Modular Building Institute, and also HUD, which is reassessing its own role in the offsite world, even the term offsite. There's a lot of terms out there. And so we thought, and some of those terms are overlapping. Some of those terms are used in different ways by different agencies. And yet at the same time, those terms have a big impact on just some issues like general public perception of offsite construction, a common industry understanding within the industry, but also things like financing and entitlements, legalese, let's say, also the terminology, regulations and codes, and procurement and bidding construction. And so what we thought would be worthwhile is just to even explain a little bit, things like prefab, which is the widely used term, something that we noticed came back around in the late 90s, early 2000s. Dwell magazine almost rebranded the term from what had a negative connotation to a positive one. And it's a term that's still used pretty widely, wouldn't you say, Ryan?
Yeah, I'd say so, and especially in pop culture, and yeah, it's very popular among It's this one's an interesting term. Factory built, which Housing and Urban Development HUD. We all are familiar with HUD code, and we'll be talking about that as well. But factory built is really comes from Operation Breakthrough and some of those reports from the 60s and 70s in which it outlined if you were to pull things into a factory environment, i.e. reusing, shipbuilding and auto manufacturing factories to build homes, you could get some of the same efficiencies. So we still hear that term used in relationship to all things offsite.
Yeah, we hear it used and it shows up in even certain legal documents. And then again, say manufactured, which is a term that HUD uses as well, often interchangeably with factory built. And also the Department of Transportation often uses it interchangeably with modular, again, which creates some confusion, some anxiety, different systems, different products.
Yeah, and that's a little bit of a challenge. I was going to say that, it's a little bit of a challenging term, right, Ivan, because what you're saying is things that are manufactured. Well, there's a whole host of things that are manufactured. So why did HUD code or the mobile home industry usurp this one term? Gives some heartache to some people. So.
And a tongue twister to us whenever we lecture on this, when we have to talk about a modular manufacturer versus a manufactured housing manufacturer, which is a bit of a pain. There's terms like building systems, and HB likes to use, which was a term that was very popular also in the 1960s. It was also used in Europe, but it's also a bit confusing because in architectural and construction terminology, really, that's a category. So it includes all buildings are made of some kind of building system or another. And yet in the NHB world, it's a term that sort of relates more specifically to what we might call offsite.
Yeah, and I think added to that, Ivan, would be that NHB set up a council years ago called this Building Systems Council, one of their councils. And really it was referring to things at the time that were like prefabricated roof trusses and things associated with the Structural Building Components Association, which is an association that partners on the NHB. But, it also now is encompassing all things, including panelized and, three-dimensional volumetric modular solutions.
Yeah. So it's an even wider term than offsite in a way.
Yeah.
Then we have the term modular, which again is a very American term. It's a term that's in some ways synonymous with offsite construction in the US context. And a term that's used in a number of different ways, and more colloquially by architects, but more specifically by a sort of maintained. Its concept is maintained by the Modular Building Institute and the Modular Home Builders Association.
And permanent modular construction, right? That MBI uses, PMC is their definition of trying to distinguish, permanent modular construction versus relocatable modular solutions. Yeah,
right.
so, yeah.
And then the division between, again, another division which is sort of somewhat arbitrary between the residential side and the quote unquote commercial side, which is also confusing to some folks. And when we speak to affordable housing advocates and they hear about commercial modular construction, they ask about, what about multifamily? Well, in the industry, commercial is synonymous with multifamily, and yet it's not necessarily a widely understood term. Also, we also know that MHBA members in the last 10 years have increasingly expanded their focus from residential to multifamily or commercial, if we're to use the industry term, and that also gets a bit confusing. So those terms could be clarified, and certainly these two associations, which have had a very strong showing in the last few years in terms of advocacy for the industry, might want to revisit what they really want the term to connotate. Then we have terms like industrialized building, which we have in the US, we've seen in other places. In Sweden, that we've come across it as still a kind of umbrella term for offsite construction. We also see rational building actually as another kind of a rationalized building. It's another older term. We've used that as well.
Yeah.
And we have more exotic terms.
Montage is sort of a more popularized version of this. Yeah, unit build's interesting in Japan, right? Box built or unit built, which is referring essentially to three-dimensional volumetric modular construction. Yeah.
Right. Right, and then we kind of coming back around to a term that has been catching on and is becoming more of a industry standard is the term offsite itself. It's still relatively new, right? When you wrote your seminal book 15 or 20 years ago, that term was not in as wide of a use, right? Now it's become a lot more popular.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's also OSM and OSC, offsite manufacturing versus offsite construction. Those acronyms are often more specifically used in the UK, but I guess we've seen offsite becoming a more common term that in broader kind of vernacular discourse around this type of construction. And what we've noticed that one of the big factors to the term existed before, but what's really standardized its usage is the highly impactful 2017 McKinsey Global Institute report, Reinventing Construction: A Route to Higher Productivity. We're right in the beginning of the report. The term offsite is used, it's consistently used, refers to a construction project which is built from prefabricated standard components in a manufacturing facility. So again, what we found is that the term prefab is still pretty widely used, right? In conversations with Silicon Valley companies, with building products companies, even with some public agencies not specifically associated with HUD, the term offsite is becoming an industry standard, if it isn't already there, as one that describes really what we would once have called prefabricated or factory-built construction. Yeah,
and I'll just add to that, Ivan, that it's important to note, McKinsey and some of its roots in the UK, in Britain, and therefore we see the term offsite being used in the UK earlier than the United States and Canada, and now since McKinsey's put out this report, there's been a considerable uptick in that use of offsite. So we're still learning from, in as much as we don't want to, we're still learning from England as a country per se, in vocabulary and terminology.
Yeah, so I think one of the goals of today has been also to start to say that, we haven't, Ryan and I are very passionate about these. We think terminology is very important, not just because we're academics. It actually has a real economic impact and a legislative one. But we're happy to see that, actually, to give credit to the McKinsey report in a way, the McKinsey report did not invent this term. but they did their homework, and they have had a very high success in expanding the use of this term outside of the industry. I think the finance sector now is more familiar with this term. And we actually think that, going forward, this is a term that we should try to standardize. This is a term that maybe HUD should consider adopting, as opposed to a terminology that has become somewhat antiquated and is not as familiar anymore, or it might even be confusing to folks. So again, the idea of construction project being built from prefabricated standardized components off-site in a manufacturing facility seems like a good term, but not just because we like it, but because really on a kind of empirical level, this is a term that a lot of decision makers in the public and private sector are seeing. And so we actually think that's a good thing. And really it's up to maybe some of the more established players within the industry to consider adopting this in a more formal manner. So if once we identify offsite, then we can move on to a subset, or a term which is a particular kind of offsite construction, which is modular construction. So following the success of the 2017 report, also following the success of a report we prepared for the Modular Building Institute, in which we discussed in another video, McKinsey came back and specifically focused again on a particular kind of offsite construction. So there are many kinds of offsite construction. And they decided to do a report on what they call modular construction, titled Modular Construction from Projects to Products. And again, here, we've extracted some pages from that report. It's an excellent report, it's publicly available. And we thought it was very useful to see modular, as understood by the McKinsey report, is a little different than the way that we understand it in the US. But again, because it's McKinsey, this is the definition that is catching on. Where modular, so here we see a chart that describes modular construction covers a broad set of approaches. And we see actually a range of approaches from 1D, so components like a Sears Roebuck house, to 2D or panels, like many of the products that Katerra is developing, to 3D, or what we more commonly in the US often refer to as modular or volumetric modular, which in this case is actually referred to as 3D modular. And again, this chart, like the term offsite, comes from the UK. In fact, we actually think it's more or less directly rooted in some of the research that has been done by our colleague, Robert Hairston's, who is not cited in this report, but maybe should have been. Anyway, but so then this is a slightly different definition of modular. And Ryan, what do you think about this approach to is this too broad? Is this more specific? How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because offsite then would be considered a much broader and generalized term for anything that is built off the job site and then brought to the job site and assembled in place, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that everything that we do like that. For example, multi-trade prefabrication that's being done on big hospitals around the country, those are offsite prefabricated elements, maybe in a warehouse nearby or near to site manufactured, but they're certainly not considered modular, I would say, because modular imbues a whole different process, a vertically integrated process of delivery that is much different than traditional construction. Whereas I think, multi-trade or near-site manufacturing, as we're seeing a lot of, might be considered prefabricated or off-site, but it doesn't have some of the contractual obligations or regulatory frameworks around and processes that go into actually delivering a quote-unquote modular. So modular is much more nuanced and much more involved as a delivery process than offsite is as a general term. And I think that's what McKinsey is trying to get at by using it in this way. Is they're talking about it
and
here.
It's interesting because
products. Yeah.
Well, the one thing, and again, we both, I think, very much admire this report. The one thing that I think it's almost takes too much for granted, this understanding. It's taken even us a while to understand what they meant. And we certainly live and breathe and stuff on a daily basis in terms of what they mean by modular, because it's certainly different than the way that modular as a term has been used. One thing that's fascinating about this diagram too is that it actually covers the scope of the services and products that we saw in Japan. So someone like Sekisui House makes 1D or kit of parts systems, which are highly prefabricated in a factory offsite, and which are, again, designed for a particular use in a particular site, they have 2D panelized, and then we've seen, companies like Second Studio Heim, which focuses on quote unquote unit system, or 3D, in this case, what we call 3D modular. And yet again, in Japan, they still refer to this as simply prefabrication or high prefabrication. Those three approaches, the 1D, the 2D, and the 3D, in this case modular, all share something in common, which is that the components are designed and manufactured for particular use. They're not interchangeable. And that made us also think of a term that is widely used in engineering, but not so widely used in construction industry yet, which is the notion of a closed system as opposed to an open system. A closed system being a system where structurally and for other performance criteria, all the components are pre-engineered, pre-designed for a particular use and for a particular assembly. So they're not just prefabricated, they're not just made in a factory off-site, they're also, the design decision is made from day zero that this will be a particular kind of manufacturing process. And that's one thing in the report, which, again, all due respect to McKinsey, is missing. It's just this simple observation that it's really the design decision up front, not just the manufacturing decision, that distinguishes modular from other forms of not just construction, but even offsite construction. And so as we see, it's in the report. It's in the spirit of the report. I just wish it was a little more explicit. So here we have another page straight from the report where it gives an example. Project-specific requirements will determine the choice of a modular system. So whether it's 1D, 2D, or 3D, but it's decided at a design phase. It's not decided at a procurement phase, at a manufacturing phase. It is decided from the very beginning. And all of those approaches, the 1D, the 2D, or the 3D, are viable to almost any building typology. The question is, where do you lie on the degree of the complexity of component and the degree of on-site work? Because in each one of these, there's almost there's a direct relationship between how much more on-site work you're going to be doing from 1D to 2D to 3D. So again, we see it in the report they're saying 2D to 3D panels. They're showing it, what's really valuable is they're showing this as a full spectrum. We often hear within the industry, on the one hand, we can modular manufacturers say, well, we can build anything. On the other hand, there's a comment saying there's only certain projects that modular is ideal for. In this case, really, it's saying that there's actually a modular solution for almost every project. It depends on where it falls on the degree of prefabrication and pre-assembly.
Yeah, I might just add to that. The degree the degree to which the stakeholders are involved, the degree to which vertical alignment is needed. I would say, in our research, we've demonstrated that the degree to which that's required increases as the complexity of the quote unquote modularization increases, right? So modular immediately imbues this notion that you're going to have to coordinate more. You're going to have design up front more. You're going to have to consider those things more in order to get their benefits. And if you don't consider that, you have no business going into the realm of modular, because you're just causing more problems than are worth, right? You're going to have negative cost and schedule implications if you just try to apply a product solution without really bringing the design process and all those other contingent parameters to bear early in the project.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Yeah, and it does suggest that even though we're describing this as a closed system, there's a degree of openness, there's a degree of internal flexibility to the systems that's pre-engineered, not so much for even construction, but even for the negotiation process, the design process, the procurement process, where there is a degree of flexibility that is different from conventional construction, but it's built into the system. And we've seen that again, we'll see that when we look into some of the more mature systems in Sweden and Japan, where actually the number of mods and mod types is higher than many US manufacturers. And that's because we've noticed that actually through the process of standardization, which is an open process, that kind of feedback loop, once you're vertically integrated, says that it's not always just about repeatability of identical mods that brings a kind of efficiency. It's really also a degree of openness and a degree of flexibility. The balance between how closed the system is and how open it is really where the quality, but also the economic sense plays out in the systems. And again, that's what's interesting about this report. Even this report gets to the idea, which seems to be a sort of obvious one, that 2D, as Ryan mentioned, 2D systems have certain benefits, 3D systems have certain benefits. But in a sense, the report alludes to the idea of what they call a 2D plus 3D hybrid, combining the best of both worlds, in which there's this idea not so much from whether it's from a project perspective or more importantly from a product platform perspective, the idea to plan for production capacities that can hover between 2D and 3D. And that's again something we've seen in Sweden and Japan. The volumetric companies work through a panelization process to a volumetric process. And they have the opportunity and have done so, and we will be speaking to Lindback about this very soon. They're able to, even a volumetric company is able to produce panelized product, and a panelized company is able to ramp up fairly quickly if they decide to see value in a 3D product. And that ability, that flexibility within what we're calling a closed system seems to also be a very important factor in the economic viability of investing in a system like this. So again, just what we're here to do is we're not here to invent our own terminology. In fact, that is the one thing we want to make clear. If there's one thing you want to take away from this discussion today is we don't think we need new terms. We think the terms are out there, just like we don't necessarily need so many new technologies. We think some technologies are out there already. They're quite great, but the terms are there. In fact, again, thanks to McKinsey and to many other people, but McKinsey has, because of the reputation, put the work of many other people in the hands of decision makers that unfortunately were not considering these issues before. The term modular now is evolving. The term offsite has evolved too. And it's really important in the US particularly, where we have a lot of different definitions, a lot of different terms, to start considering the need for a more consistent terminology, one that's thought through and one that is clearly defined. So again, just pulling out some of the headlines from the report, modular construction covers a broad set of approaches. That sounds great to me. Sounds like it's flexible, sounds like it can accommodate different typologies. But on the other hand, and this is something that, again, we'll talk about it and we found in our research, it is project specific. We cannot emphasize that enough. Modular construction, particularly, more so than offsite construction, as a subset, requires the consideration of a project from day one. We cannot simply modularize a project that was designed for conventional construction. It will not save time, it will not save money, and in fact, it quite often does the other. On the other hand, it's also important for modular manufacturers to stop claiming that this is even a possibility, because it really hurts not just their own bottom lines, but the industry. And then finally, there's something we'll see and we'll explore more. There's this very interesting, instead of having to pick between 2D modular, or what we used to call panelized, and 3D modular, or what we used to call volumetric, both McKinsey report as well as global case studies are starting to suggest that really there's a spectrum that a product platform can accommodate both. And there's serious benefits, and those still have to be explored, economic benefits as well as other benefits to thinking about this as a continuum, thinking about the 2D, 3D hybrid. And that's something we're going to be exploring further in our conversations with other experts. But so this is, again, all we want to do as ModX is really take something we've always prided ourselves on. We're an exchange. We're a knowledge transfer platform. We don't want to invent new terms. We don't want anyone else to invent new terms. The terms are out there. We need to adopt the right terms. And so just back to this older diagram. This is one of our diagrams that grew out of the 5 and 5 research, if I'm correct. Which is a bit of a critique, honestly, of the situation we are in the US, in the volumetric modular industry particularly, and where we see it going. So on the top diagram, what we see as a kind of typical business practice in the US is that modular manufacturers tend to focus on making mods. They are not in control of decisions at the design phase, nor at the supply chain phase, nor are they often entirely involved in the assembly or montage. And that model inherently, and this is some tough love for the volumetric modular industry, but that model actually contradicts the definition of modular that we have just discussed. This is not, therefore, if modular is a closed system, which means a system where modules are prepared for a particular use, and that those decisions are not being made during the design process, that is either not a modular system or it's a modular system that will not work. It will not deliver the economic, the quality, the speed benefits that we all think and believe that these systems can. And on the other hand, again, we have not seen this approach anywhere else in the world. We have looked at a lot of places, and we have seen only the opposite approach, which is to say that a modular manufacturer, to one degree or another, is involved early on and in managing a supply chain, in developing a design, and in following through on the assembly and the finishes and the final permitting. And that's the model we see on the bottom. Good news is we've seen this model in almost every new player, and at least every new successful player in the US as well. So it's really time to rethink a little bit what we claim modular to be.
You got the next slide up, Ivan? There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is
go ahead, Brian.
Yeah. Well, this is my micro in New York. Was built as manufactured as steel, and even though it has a product platform, you can see the product here. It's a steel sections, floor pan with a deck, and you might say, well, that's a standardized product. It is, but it's a standardized product platform that is a modular solution that can be adapted to this specific project. This was a very tight site, so it had to be adapted to this situation. And so it was designed for manufacture and assembly by N architects in connection with the engineer and the modular manufacturer in deep connection.
And developer.
Early on. And so I think that's the key we're trying to demonstrate is you might have a standard product platform, whether it's light wood platform frame, panels or modules, or steel panels or modules, but those solutions, in order to be considered modular, really are designed with the end assembly in mind.
Right. And in this case, again, this was even the competition brief itself required that, which we really applaud. So this was the Bloomberg administration, the recent de Blasio administration has had similar approaches to modular in New York City recently. Again, the idea of requiring it. And this was not a vertically integrated company. This was a collaboration. Monadnock was a developer. Again, the contractor, the manufacturer, the architects, all independent actors. So yeah, not a fully vertically integrated company per se, but a vertically integrated project. And we could actually say this is a genuinely modular project, not just because it uses volumetric modular components, but because it was designed as a closed system and it got some of those efficiencies out of this process. And so again, like just sort of wrapping up, again, we're just here to advocate. We are not here to invent new terms. We're not here to complicate those definitions. We want simpler definitions. But at the largest scale, we have offsite construction and we have onsite construction. Those seem like good terms. Prefab isn't going to disappear. But let's leave prefab to the popular press and to kind of wider discussions. And in the industry has already more or less adopted this terminology already. And it seems like again, it's a good term. It's a clear term. We understand what it means. It's a binary, and it's one that but it would be good to start seeing it replace terms like factory built. And in fact, if anything, the regulatory language is sort of far behind. It really feels, for lack of a better word, like we're in the 70s. And then again, this is yes. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to add to the open systems. If you go to that slide.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you kind of close this discussion and summarize. Open system, closed systems. A closed system, meaning those that are designed for a particular assembly in mind, right? As opposed to an offsite open system, which would be ones that could have a variety of sub-assemblies and other components that are made in the factory offsite that may not be intended for a particular use. And so we just want to distinguish between these terms. And those that are closed, we are calling modular. And those that are open would be considered more broadly, open and closed would be considered offsite. So offsite constitutes open and closed systems, and modular constitutes closed systems.
There you go. Yeah. And it's no secret here. Again, we are advocating for a more vertically integrated approach, whether it's within a company or whether it's whether it's project based. Simply to be able to, we do not believe that any of the promises that modular has given to the world about its efficiencies are going to be met until we understand this important distinction that modular is not just offsite, it's not just made in a factory, it's not just modules, it's not just three-dimensional, it is a closed system. That closed system can be more open or it can be more open, it can be more flexible, it can be less open, and that's something that's really up to the product platform. But in essence, every deliverable produced this way will be a closed system. It will be a particular, it also means that it's another issue for modular is that the idea of repeatability, modular has a perception that it might be repeatable. The closed system is very clearly emphasizing that it's not. The product platform can be highly standardized. The product that comes out of that product platform is not standardized.
Yep.
And just we wanted to borrow again from, this is actually from our good friend Von Buckley, who borrowed it from Munro and Associates, which is, it's a good way to understand what we've been talking about and the importance of understanding modular as a closed system, which is to say that, well, we often think about the material and the manufacturing and the overhead as the real cost. What seems to have not been always considered is the indirect influence, as suggested by this lean management approach to manufacturing in general, that says that design, the indirect cost of design or the impact of design is much higher than the real cost of design. And so those decisions made early on actually have a huge impact on cost and on savings. And in fact, the shadows on the back are really the reason why understanding modular as a closed system, more than whether it's an offsite system or an onsite system, is really what we're at today, and why that terminology is very important, and why that terminology will have very direct impacts on very concrete things like financing, like contracts. The fact that now, again, for architects and engineers, those early phases become more important. For financing a project, those decisions become more important. We need that clear terminology if we're to move forward in very tangible, very practical issues, again, like getting our contracts to work with offsite and modular construction, getting a regulatory framework to understand the needs of offsite and modular construction. All of those things are related to clear terminology.
Well, thank you very much, Ivan. And I'll thank myself, Ryan, and thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, we really appreciate everyone joining and look forward to seeing you again. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.